The general sentiment, I think it's a fair reflection of where we're at as a nation. We're kind of hurting, Craig, because you guys have been given the nod from World Rugby. Is there something in the points that Mick was making there in terms of the stadia that, I mean, this is one of the sticking points and it's one of the main areas that we've been reflecting on over the last week since World Rugby made its recommendation that actually we have some good stadia. We have them sort of almost entirely in city centre, so they're good access. We believe we can fill them. Are they things that you think might be, I mean, we view that maybe South Africa, as Mick said, the stadia are a little bit outside the cities and potentially they may not be full for some of the lesser games?
Well, I'm not sure that the Irish bid committee came to South Africa, because if they did, they would know that most of the stadiums are smack bang in the middle of the cities as well. Loftus Versfeld's in a stone's throw from Pretoria Central, Ellis Park's in downtown Johannesburg, Cape Town Stadium's in Greenpoint, which is literally under Table Mountain. The PE Stadium, Nelson Mandela Bay, is right in the centre of the city as well. Free State Stadium's in the centre of Bloemfontein, so the only one is the National Stadium where the final will be held, and that's literally between the city centre of Johannesburg and Soweto, so it falls into pretty much the centre of town as well. So from that point of view, that's nonsense. That the South African stadiums are way outside cities. There's good transport to most of them, to all of them in fact, and yes, they have battled to fill stadiums for Pro 14 and Super Rugby, but the World Cup's an entirely different beast. I mean, the Football World Cup in 2010, South African football stadiums are pretty much operating at about quarter full most of the time for league games. You couldn't get a ticket for love or money for the 2010 Football World Cup, and that wasn't just because of overseas visitors, because you must remember the global economy crashed in 2008, and that really affected sales and visitors to South Africa for the 2010 World Cup, and yet the stadiums are full for pretty much every game, and a Rugby World Cup will be no different. I mean, South Africans will lap up tickets for that, and obviously there'll be a lot of visitors from overseas as well.
What are the levels of excitement like down there? I mean, it's reading even this morning's newspapers, Craig, it's more the, Steve Tuve, New Zealand is behind the South Africa bid. It certainly looks as if that's the way it's going, if we're to be honest about it here. What are the it's a tournament you've hosted before very successfully, one of the great sports stories of all time, in fact. What's the sense of excitement, if any, down there about the way this thing looks like it's going?
Yes, it's very excited. I mean, I think people are really happy. I mean, look, South African rugby, let's not kid ourselves, hasn't been in a great place for a few years now. And South Africa as a country has been struggling. We've got a lot of issues, social issues, economic issues with corruption in government, and you only have to look at the United States. They've got issues too, with their government. And these are not going to go away because we're having Rugby World Cup. But what it does do is give hope to the country. And, South Africa is a place that takes a lot of momentum out of sports events and tries to build on it. And we haven't always been successful in that. But I think this target of 6 years away, something to build towards, something for the country to come together for, is massive for South Africa. And I have no doubt that it will be well supported. It will be terrifically run. It will be a great show, and South Africans will embrace it. And hopefully, some of the momentum we get from it, if the vote goes our way on November the 15th, and the momentum we get from the tournament and the build-up and the infrastructure that around it, the infrastructure improvements, will only be a positive thing for the country.
Morning, Craig. I'm sure you saw Gregor Paul's column in the New Zealand Herald over the weekend, referring to the fact that there are 30 million people living in poverty in South Africa, and he reckons there needs to be a significant number of foreign visitors to fill these stadiums. Now, I know 1995 was one of the most iconic sports tournaments of all time, but even if you look at the quarter-final stage, outside of the South Africa-Western Samoa match in Ellis Park, which garnered a crowd of 54,000 people, you look at France-Ireland, which had 20,000 spectators, England-Australia, which had 35,000 spectators, and New Zealand-Scotland, which had 28,000 spectators, all in stadiums which have a capacity of over 50,000. Has society moved on to a point in South Africa that 28 years later these stadiums will be full, that the local people will be able to afford to go to these games, and we will have full stadiums for these important matches from the knockout stages?
Well, look, I mean, obviously there's millions of people that live below the poverty line in South Africa, and getting those people involved in the World Cup is always going to be a challenge. But like FIFA did in 2010, there was a really interesting ticketing structure for World Cup. And you must remember, this is going to be the first Rugby World Cup in South Africa in the professional era. The previous World Cup you were referring to there happened in the amateur era. There's far less corporate hospitality around. There's far less, of those kind of ticket sales that go through corporates, and a lot more people are interested in the sport and interested in the event, not so much rugby itself. So there will be a ticketing structure that will certainly try and include all South Africans at a minimum cost in certain venues and certain games. So, it will be a challenge, but I don't see a problem filling the stadiums. And certainly you might find one or two pool games won't be sold out. I mean, the smallest stadium South Africa is using is 43,500 seaters. So, it's going to take quite an effort to run it at 100% capacity, but I don't even think Rugby World Cup in England ran at 100% capacity in terms of ticket sales.
Part of the bid, Craig, was obviously from a South African point of view to convince World Rugby that South Africa is a country that's politically and economically stable. I've been trying to crunch some of the Grant Thornton report that South Africa commissioned into this, and it seems as if it's a thing that's going to make money. I think if my maths are correct, and wholly accepting that converting rand to euro, it may be wildly off. I think it was somewhere in the region of 16 million euro that it was going to be worth to the South African economy, and that a lot of the 40,000 jobs created, temporary and permanent, was one that stood out. Any sense of how the division of wealth, I guess, on this one, in terms of that figure, is going to impact on some of the lesser economic households in South Africa?
Look, I mean, that's a tough one for me to answer. I'm just a humble sports journalist. You might need an economic journalist for that. But, there's obviously been planning put in place that money does filter down to legacy projects and to underprivileged communities. How that's going to be divided, I don't know. But one thing I know, that this World Cup won't cost a lot to put on. The initial outlay is going to be very low. Of the three bids, it's by far the lowest, because all the stadiums are built, all the airports have been upgraded for 2010. Most of the road networks were upgraded. They will only take minor upgrades, and most of the hotels were put in place in 2010, and there's been a few more due to tourism. So in terms of cost to the country to put on this World Cup, it's negligible. So pretty much any money that is earned from it will go into the profit column.